Think about the single button that we want to place on screen. I've drawn the button here in green and the view in blue. Let's assume we want it on the center of the screen, regardless if our app is running on an iPhone or an iPad Pro. The button should always be in the center, even when the app is on different device orientations, from portrait to landscape. Constraints are the rules that tell iOS how to position and size this particular UI element. So if we were to think of placing the record button on the center, we need the distance from the top, the distance from the bottom, the distance from the leading, and finally the distance from the trailing edges of the view. If you're following along, you're thinking, okay, 4 constraints. And you would be correct, except most user interface elements have what we call an intrinsic size. That is, they have a built-in height and width. In the button's case, this height and width is automatically calculated based on the text and font size you selected for the button's text. If iOS knows the height and width of a UI element, like a record button, then it only needs half the constraints to size and position it. That is to say, if I tell iOS how far from the top of the screen the button will be, then it can automatically calculate how far from the bottom it needs to be. If we tell it the leading constraint, iOS can automatically calculate the trailing constraint based on the width of our green button. So the rule goes as follows. You need a minimum of 2 constraints in each dimension or axes, X and Y, to properly size and lay out a UI element, except if that UI element has an intrinsic size, then you only need 1 constraint for each dimension or axes, X and Y. iOS can figure out the other constraint based on the intrinsic size. Last thing to remember, when setting a constraint, we're always comparing one thing to another. The record button placement is relative to the UI view it's contained in. In other words, its parent. I've represented the UI view by this blue rectangle outline. Right now, the UI view is full screen. But if we make it a different size, the record button will be still centered in that view.